Good morning, church. Good morning. Welcome to Kingsway. We're so glad you're here. If you're visiting online or listening online, super glad that you're tuning in with us today. 14 years ago in September, I moved to Indiana. We bought a house throughout the next few months, and then in around December, we closed on the house. I started painting the house and that kind of thing. And then in January, I think it was, we finally moved in, 2015. And I realized very quickly, living in Indiana without a basement has a certain downside in certain seasons. I remember because right when we moved here, we had a little baby boy, and then a little over a year later, we had our second boy come along. And I don't remember exactly how old everybody was, but it was one of those nights where Rachel, my wife, and I were up late and watching the weather. And as the weather was developing, we started going, wow, there's a massive storm kind of headed our way. This is before everybody had them on apps on their phone. I know some of you can remember 15 years ago, 14 years ago, whatever it was. And so we're watching this thing come our way. And it's like, what do you do? When you have, say, a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, do you wake them up at 2 in the morning and risk it? Or do you, if they're gonna sleep, just let them sleep and let it go? Well, when the sirens start going off, which are not far from our house, it's that moment you're like, fine. So I remember waking up the boys and taking them down to the only place in the house we felt like was safe. It's our downstairs bathroom. It's a single person bathroom. Now, with 2 small ones, there is standing room only, and you're trying to entertain a 2-year-old and a baby or whatever exactly the age they were, I don't remember. I just remember being crammed in there when my wife says to me, did you get the weather radio? Which I guess, back then was a big deal, right? Nowadays, who knows? And I was like, oh, no, I think I left it out there. And I went and got it and brought it in, and we plugged it in. And then she went, you're gonna plug it in? What if the power goes out? Oh yeah. So I had to go out, find batteries, bring them back into the bathroom, hope that they worked. And then she looked at me and says, did you grab any water? And I'm looking at her and saying, am I the only one that I had to think about what is happening in this moment? Now, if you've ever been in a major storm, you know this. There are so many things you can't prepare for. They just happen. Now, there's a certain amount of things you can prepare for. And that is going to be the perfect setting and environment for what I want to talk to you about today. So where we are in the book of Luke. And if you have not been with us, no worries at all. I'll tell a few stories to bring you up to speed. But where we were in Luke chapter 8, which means today we're going to be in Luke chapter 9. In Luke chapter 8, Jesus says this, verse 16. No one lights a lamp and hides it in a clay jar or puts it under a bed. Instead, they put it on a stand so that those who come in can see the light. Pretty simple analogy. In Jesus' day, they didn't have on and off switches, right? So the way you had to get light in a room is you would light, and they're super cool. You could just Google them. You can look them up. You could buy a fake one on Amazon. They're just these small little circular things with a thing coming out the end of it there. I don't know what to think of that. That was so helpful. And anyway, they put oil down in there, and they'd stick a wick in that thing that sticks out that I'm not doing a good job of describing, and they'd light it. And then you could keep putting oil in there, and as long as there was oil continuing in the lamp could keep burning. Sooner or later, the wick would go out, you put a new wick, but it was pretty simple to manage it and keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. But it was only beneficial if it's in the middle of the room. You don't take it and store it and hide it. You've got to put it out so that the light from the lamp that I described really well can be seen by everybody. And that's Jesus' analogy. But here, he's not really talking about lamps, and he's not really talking about real clay jars. He's simply using an analogy that the light that Jesus has given you is supposed to be on full display for all to see. What benefit is it if Jesus gives you his light and you hide it and you bury it and you don't display it? So after this, in Luke chapter 8, we see 3 miracles happen. I didn't talk to you about 2 of them in this series because I've taught on that text 2 or 3 times in the last few years. So I realize those of you who are new are like, but I want to hear it. I know, you just have to go back and listen to all of our sermons over the last few years. See, it was a trick. But I also thought, man, if I go deal with the same text again, those of you who have been here will be like, really, again? So here's what those 3 stories are very quickly. Number 1, Jesus finds a man who is demon-possessed. We talked about this last year. He's got a demon problem. And Jesus drives the demon out of that man. Then the next two stories are Jesus is on his way into a town to proclaim the gospel, and he finds that there's a little girl there who is really, really sick, and he's begged to come and heal her. And he starts to go over to heal her, and another woman who's been bleeding for years, and she has seen all the doctors back in that day, and none of them could help her with her bleeding problem. And so Jesus ends up stopping. She touches his cloak, and she gets healed immediately. Instantly, her bleeding stops. In the meantime, the little girl who was sick dies. And Jesus goes and he literally grabs her by the hand and she gets up and she's now alive. Those are the three stories that conclude Luke chapter 8, which is really important for what's about to happen as we kick off Luke chapter 9. Because Jesus did all of these things in the presence of the people and the disciples. And I get it. If you're checking this Jesus thing out, you're like, how do I know it's true? And it's the question that people have been asking for 2,000 years. But here's what it comes down to. The bottom line, if I just had to summarize it like this, the bottom line, how do I know if it's true? You only have a couple of choices. Option A, the disciples were liars, making up stories about Jesus because they're the ones who told these stories and wrote them down. Now, the problem, if that's true, option A, that they're liars, if that's true, there are thousands and thousands of people in all these different towns and villages all together who saw Jesus do these things. It would be so easy when the Bible says, and they went into this town and they healed this person. Many times they're mentioning important people by name, rulers, leaders, authorities, things like that. It would be so easy in Jesus' day for someone to go, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. I know that guy. I know his daughter. That never happened. But see, we don't have those documents. Where are all the historical books telling us that the disciples were lying? So option B is it actually did happen, and the people who saw it testified to it, and they told us the truth. Now, if that happened, you would expect that people who didn't want that message to get out would try to stop that message. And that's actually what we see happening, which is why the early church was so profoundly persecuted. They were attacked, arrested, killed, put on trial over and over and over again. And yet they never backed down from their story of what they saw. Now, I'm just gonna let that sit with you because I don't know where you are, where you're coming from, or what you're wrestling with today. But I say that because remember this lamp and light analogy, because then in Luke chapter 9, Jesus says this. When Jesus had called the 12 together, now the 12 are the 12 disciples who would become the 12 apostles. Well, it'd be 12 minus 1 plus 1, which is still 12. But without going too deep into that, one of the guys in the group betrays Jesus. His name is Judas, and he literally ends up killing himself. But that's for a future when we get there. So we got the 12 disciples who would later be called the apostles. And he calls the 12 together. Now we're gonna find out next chapter he has more disciples than that, but these are the 12 leaders among all the other disciples. And he gave them power and authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases. Remember, he just did that in chapter 8. So they've watched him, they've observed him, they've witnessed him doing this. And now he basically says, your turn. You go do what I've been doing. And he says he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. That's verse 2. Sends them out. So now, you've been with me, you've watched me, you've seen me, now go. I don't know about you, but that seems terrifying. Okay, Jesus, I was with you when you were healing the guy who was filled with all the demons, the legion, in the last sermon. I was with you, but me? I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle it. I still have questions like, what's the process? What's the method by which I have to do this? But there's no time for that. And we're gonna see that in just a minute. See, what you need to get, the takeaway for us is this. Jesus is all about multiplying his life into our everyday lives. What Jesus is trying to get the disciples to do is, what I've been doing is so you could observe who I am and what I want to do in the world, and now I'm gonna give you me. You've got my power, my authority, so go. You have my power and my authority, now go. He told them, verse 3, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Y'all be the stinky disciples, just go, okay? Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. There's a lot to unpack here. So this is like, I got to do some Bible teaching real quick. Okay, so when you open your Bible, you're going to see 4 gospel books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, the book we're in, and then John. I've said this before. John is writing his book. He's kind of on his own page. He's doing his own thing. It's one of the most beautifully, masterfully written books. It's unbelievable. John wrote the book of Revelation. It's also beautiful and masterful and just so well woven together. And no, I don't understand any more than you do. I'm just kidding. Maybe a little bit more, but not much. Okay. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call the synoptic gospels. You can tell that they leaned into each other as they were writing their book. Scholars love to debate who wrote first, and there's all these different theories behind it. It doesn't really even matter as far as any of us are concerned today, except for that what you will see then is when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll often see the same stories in the same order, but they'll have a little bit of a different detail depending on what's happening. And that's important for this text because what we see between these 3 books is a little bit of what we would call a discrepancy. And it leaves you to ask the question, what's the discrepancy and why? And so I don't have them all to show you. You'll have to look it up for yourself. But what you will see if you look up these discrepancies is really fascinating for this. Because in Mark, he tells them to grab their staff. And in Matthew, he tells them, I can't remember, something very, very similar, at least in the Greek, it's very similar to this with a slight variation in the word that he uses, which brings up this great question. Can we even trust the Bible if Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't even say the exact same thing? And the answer is absolutely yes. Because what that shows us to our question we asked earlier is the disciples didn't get together and cook the books. The disciples didn't get together and say, let's make sure that every single word we use is the exact same so that nobody can ever have a question. See, if you are a detective, you would start to question a story if when you're interviewing the witnesses, everybody has the exact same story with all the exact same details, and there is no variation in perspective whatsoever. The power of it is that there really isn't a discrepancy here. The power of it is there is uniqueness here, which tells you what they're testifying to actually happened. And the reason that's important in this text is not because one of them got it right and one of them got it wrong. It probably means something more like this. There is such a profound urgency to what Jesus is telling them that they don't have time to wait. So if you have your staff with you, grab it. Don't go back home and grab your staff. Don't go back home and grab clothes. Do not put this off at all. Go and go now. So that's how you can bring those 2 things together. But what it really places into our heart is this idea that you don't need any of these things because God's gonna take care of it. When I went to Mexico for the first time and I met our missionary there, Ernesto, I got to be there the exact day. They're building this hospital. It's like, I don't know, 85 or so, 80% of the way there right now. And they were buying the land. In fact, when we were there, they had just bought the land. And they got to meet with some of the local governing officials. I remember I'm sitting there and I speak enough Spanish to get you chicken while you're on your way to the bathroom. That's about it, okay? But I do know about 50 words or maybe 70 words at the time, probably less so now, enough that I can pick up. So I'm sitting there with Dale Justice, one of our elders at the time, great man from Kingsway, and I have no idea really what they're saying, but I'm picking up enough words to go, oh, he just said home. Oh, he just said land. Oh, he just said money. So that's all I really understood. And then Ernesto came over and I'm downloading, like, tell me what you said and how you said it. And I'll never forget, Ernesto basically said to this man, he said, the Bible tells me that when I come to invite you into the story of what God is doing, but if you say no, to shake the dust off my feet as a pronouncement of judgment. So you have a choice. Are you gonna join us in what God intends to do in this town or not? And I thought, oh, the boldness of our missionary. But it also was like a kick in the pants because I'm so afraid to be that bold sometimes. But see, the disciples are being sent out with power and authority. Power and authority. If Jesus is who we say he is, and I believe he is, if he is the Son of God, if he is God in the flesh, if he is the Savior of all mankind, so much so that the demons beg him for him not to throw them into the abyss. And now he's giving that power and authority away. What does that mean for us today? When I got to Kingsway, it was hard. I was 32 years old. had just adopted my oldest son. About a year in, my wife got pregnant with her second. And I'll just be honest, I had no idea what I was doing. I tried to convince the leadership at Kingsway, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, you should not hire me. I kept telling him, guys, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna have to lead from my knees because I don't know what I'm doing. Well, as various challenges would pop up in the role that nobody had ever trained me for, nobody had ever talked to me about. I remember I sat down with a friend and a mentor. His name was Dr. John Walker. He ran the Blessing Ranch. John's retired now, but I remember he was in southern Indiana around Evansville, and so I drove down to do lunch with him, and I just remember eating pizza with him that day, and I remember he encouraged me with these words. He said, it's as if Jesus is telling these disciples, I am all the resource you will need, and I am with you. I walked away that day super, super pumped up and encouraged. Not because I had new answers, but I had new confidence in the one who was with me. See, when you're going through a storm and you aren't sure how it's gonna work out or if you have all the resources or what all the pieces you're gonna need are, there is one thing you have to have, and that is confidence in God. That no matter what I face next, no matter how I face it, God is with me. And what's powerful about this is Jesus is promising the disciples, I am going to resource you. I'm gonna do that. God is gonna make sure you get everything you need. But there's also a little bit of a caveat in there, right? You go to somebody's house, you aren't sure if that's gonna provide for you. And if they say no, shake the dust off your feet. That's a sign of judgment over them and just move on to the next house. But God is gonna provide. You just don't know how yet. But the goal is not to sit in fear, not to run away, not to not step into the challenge. Keep moving forward as God provides, as God stirs in the hearts of people who say, I don't know everything about this, but I wanna be a part of it. Verse 6, so they went out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. So they go out and they're effective at what they do. And then they're done, and they all come back, probably different times because they all went out in different places, different lengths of time. Verse 10, when the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. I love this. So they're like, could you imagine that day, like getting together? It's like after the big game when you won, right? And you get together and they're all celebrating. It worked, I did it. You'll never believe it. I saw this crazy woman, whatever. And I'm like, yo, that was my sister, my aunt, whatever. You know, like, this worked, it worked, I did it, it worked. If you've ever had that feeling, have you ever finished serving Jesus in some way, and somebody comes up and says, thank you, or you have no idea how much I needed that. There are stories I can't tell sometimes because either I don't have their permission yet or it's just not time in the story. One of the coolest things is when you see God piece together a story, something that you go, I couldn't have controlled that. We had one last week, and I look forward to the day when I can tell you the details. But if I were just to go through all the pieces, it blows my mind. It makes me sit and wonder and go, God, I don't know why you let me be a part of this. I'm such a scrum. Like, who is Matt Nickerson? Like, every time I meet you in public, you tell me I'm so much shorter than you thought I would be. Like, I'm not impressive. I'm not cool. I mean, and I get to watch God. I get the front seat to see you pray and write somebody's name on a pillar and then that person show up and meet Jesus and accept him. I get to see you pray and be bold enough to invite your neighbor to meet Jesus and they show up and like the illustration on that Sunday is so perfect. It's like it was crafted exactly for them. What are the odds they show up on that Sunday? And there comes a point where you go, what if none of this is an accident? What if God really is in us, with us, desires to work through us? What if God actually wants to multiply his power and his authority in our lives? What would it take to get us to be so bold as to believe that and then act on it? That's why as a church we said this, our mission is just to become more like Jesus. And it's not very catchy. I had one pastor of a huge church who's now retired tell me that is a terrible mission statement. I said, maybe. Because he's like, there's no action in it. Like, people need an action. I'm like, you're right. But the more I get to know what Jesus is about in the world, the more this becomes an action step for me. Because when I see what Jesus is doing, then I go, gosh, I'm not doing that. I should probably start doing that. And so I don't know if it's the best or the worst mission statement ever. I just know that it's what I want to be. I want to be more like Jesus, more today than yesterday. So as his word opens up before me, as the Spirit moves in my life, as my friends call me out, convict me, encourage me, whatever it is, I want to step into that. I don't want to run away from it because I want to see what could God do if a life were offered to him fully. What could God do? What could God do with your life if it were offered to him fully? But here's the thing. So the next story, the very next story is the only public miracle that is in all the Gospels apart from the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So that tells you something, right? There's also something you can learn when you go read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and read about what happened and some of the uniqueness and some of the details and what Jesus said. I encourage you to do that sometime. But before we get to that miracle, notice this, Luke chapter 9, verse 10. Then Jesus took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Before we get to this is Jesus doing Jesus things, right? This is fascinating. So he just sent the disciples out with power and authority. They just went to war. They just went to battle with the enemy. They just served, and they just had this spiritual high of all spiritual highs. And what happens when you do that? You're tired. When you go and give and serve and act like Jesus is doing in the world, it will wear you out. My wife calls it the 2 o'clock eye roll. Because every Sunday after church, I'm usually so jacked up on adrenaline and caffeine. You know, those two things go really well together. And I'm like, yeah, baby, I got this. Like, let's go do lunch. Let's go on a big hike as a family. Like, come on, it's gonna be great. Let's all watch. Let's go play football. Forget watching football. Give me some pads. I am ready. And then 2 o'clock happens, and all the adrenaline and caffeine has run out of my body. And you can almost set a clock to it. And I am staring at the wall, and I have this zoned look on my face, and that's the moment my wife knows when she sees the look, she goes, why don't you go take a nap? I'm like, that'd be a great idea. I should probably go do that. And what's happening in that moment is my human flesh is catching up to the rest of me. The spiritual high is over, and now it's time to face the reality. I'm a human. I have limitations. I'm not perfect. And Jesus knows that, and he sees that. He's looking at his disciples that just traveled out. They just went to battle with demons and sick people and healed. And there's this high, they're excited. And they came back, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this. And Jesus tries to take them away so they can refresh. It is a biblical thing to refresh. You need it in your life. I need it in my life because your power is not coming from your ability to figure it out. Your power is not coming from your ability to read another book or 12 books, to sit down and strategize and execute the plan. Your power is coming from something bigger and greater than you, and you've got to stay connected to that. Because serving Jesus comes from a deep connection to Jesus. I was blown away this year. We did a quick serving audit so we could find out how many people are coming to Kingsway and how many of them are serving. We're still working through that. I don't have a hard number to share with you because what we know is some of you serve in 2 and 3 areas, and it skews our numbers, not just a simple 1-to-1 ratio. It also gets thrown off because some of you, God bless you, I love you, but we only see you once a month or once every 5 weeks. So what number are we counting when we're counting a total number compared to those who are serving and how many are serving 2 and 3 times? We're still working through it, but I couldn't believe how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of serving roles we see at Kingsway on a regular basis. I was like a proud father going, this is my church. I love my people. But let me just tell you, if you don't stay connected to Jesus, it'll all be for naught. Don't just serve because Jesus said serve. Don't just serve because you see yourself standing in front of a dam and it's got these holes in it with water pouring out. And if I don't stick my finger in those holes, the whole thing might come crashing down. See yourself as on mission with Jesus to be like Jesus in this world, changing lives because God has gifted you and called you and equipped you. But your connection, your power, your wisdom, whatever it is you have to offer anybody else in this church or community is coming directly from your time away with Jesus and being refreshed by him. Remember, and It's actually a typo here. John 15, verse 5. Jesus says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. This verse is so convicting to me because when I'm really tired and worn out is when I'm most tempted to rely on me. One time, I don't know if I've ever told this story publicly. I probably shouldn't. Maybe I did. One time when I was a youth pastor, we had like 120 high schoolers in the room, and we had planned on doing this big invitation. We'd been building up to it for weeks, going to call students to give their lives to Jesus Christ, and I was excited. We had the band prepared, the perfect song ready to go. I was using an illustration about a guy named Tony Campolo. Now, Tony Campolo, he has this story he tells about one time he was speaking, and I believe he was in Hawaii, and because of the time change, he found himself late at night, unable to sleep, but nothing was open, and so all he could find was like this local little bar, and he goes in, and he's just sitting there drinking a drink. I think he said it was a cup of coffee, and in walks these ladies of the night. I've used this as a sermon illustration before, his story, because it was powerful, because he listens to them talking, and one of them, I believe her name was Agatha, and Agatha tells the other ladies, hey, tomorrow is my birthday. So she goes home, and she leaves, the other ladies leave, and he looks at the owner, who's the bartender, and says, hey, do those ladies come in here every night? He said, yeah, pretty much every night, about 2 a.m. after they're done working. And he said, that one girl, yeah. What's her name? Her name's Agatha. She said tomorrow's her birthday. What if we throw her a birthday party? So they do. He and the owner and his wife, they get a cake and they get some balloons. And sure enough, when she comes in the next night and she's done working, they throw a birthday for her. And she just starts crying. She's so excited. She didn't know what to do. And they brought out this beautiful cake that his wife had made, and they show it to him. And she literally looks at him and she said, can I keep the cake? Like, you don't want to eat the cake? She's like, no, nobody's ever done anything like this for me before. And she takes the cake and she leaves. And everybody's kind of dumbfounded for a minute. And I believe Tony gets up and like says a prayer for her in front of everybody. And the owner, bartender looks at him and says, hey, you didn't tell me you were a preacher. You didn't tell me that. He said, who are you? What kind of man of God comes into a bar at 2 a.m. if there's a birthday party for a woman of the night? And he said, I'm the kind who loves my Lord. Now, I was using that story, and I was using it tied to Luke chapter 15. And back to my teenagers, that was my climactic moment, because I was trying to call these teenagers to give their life to Jesus Christ. And I had all the pieces in place. And I literally, my climactic moment, when I said this, the band was supposed to come up, start the song, everything was gonna happen. My climactic moment was I was gonna look at everybody and say, and Jesus wants to throw you a party. Come to him. And that's true, but it's not what I said. I said, Jesus wants to throw you a prostitute. And that was their response. And what made it worse is I didn't know I said it. And so I think one of the kids is playing around, maybe passing the note or making fun of something, because they're all laughing and I'm getting angry. And so I finally just stop in the middle of the invitation. I'm like, what is happening? And one of the kids has the audacity to tell me what he thinks I said. And I had the audacity to go, I did not say that. And then the entire room in unison went, yes, you did. Now, I didn't know what to do at that point. I didn't have a Bible college class on how to handle that moment. So what I did is I shut down the invitation and I just said, you know what? Let's just all stand and worship, because I felt deflated. And do you know why I did? It's because I was trying to manipulate a moment. I was trying to fabricate something where people would be so emotionally moved, they would give their lives to Jesus, and it wouldn't have to do with God stirring and moving in people's hearts. Jesus is the vine. I'm a branch. If you remain in him and he in you, you will bear much fruit. You won't have to fabricate it. You won't have to manipulate it. You won't have to do anything but show up and use the resource of God inside you. That's it. And the other side of that is, if you disconnect from the vine, over time, something happens. Disconnecting from Jesus will eventually lead to withering. Literally, I did a fire the last 2 nights with my boys, made some hot dogs and some marshmallows. I love it. It's like my favorite fall moments. But that went from going around our yard and picking up all these sticks and twigs that were dead because they had been cut off from the trees, from the storms that had come through. Jesus says in John 15:6, if you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. Verse 7, but if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it'll be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. So your connection to Jesus actually reveals to the world you're one of his. And through your connection to Jesus, there is real power and life flowing through you. Things you didn't even expect, stories you start to tell, ideas that pop in your mind, notes you start to write, songs you start to sing, things that just come out of you and you don't know, I don't even know where that came from. And then all of a sudden it changes people's lives. And you realize, wow, God has called me to be a part of something bigger than I ever thought I was gonna be a part of. So now let's get to this miracle, this one that's in all the gospel books. What happens next is, Jesus is healing all these people and he's doing all this teaching, and we learn that there are at least 5,000 men there that day. We don't exactly know how many because it's not counting women and children, so the number could easily be 8 or 10 or 12,000. Everything I said earlier, think about this. How do you lie about this and put this in your book that then gets distributed to all the churches? All somebody had to do was say, I was there that day. I mean, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Either they saw it or they didn't. But notice in Luke chapter 9, verse 12. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, Jesus, you got to send this crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we're in a remote place here. Like, we're kind of out in the middle of nowhere and everybody's collected because they heard you're here. And this is life-changing for me. I saw this a handful of years ago, life-changing for me. In Luke 9:13, Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Did Jesus mean that? That's the hinge question for us. Did Jesus mean that? Again, 5,000 men, maybe 8 to 12,000 people when you count women and children. Jesus, you gotta send these people away. There's no food here. There's no fast food restaurant. How do I feed 8 to 12,000 people? But again, if you look at one of those other gospel books, the book of John, we see a key to understanding what Jesus says here. Take a look at John chapter 6, verse 5. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, it's one of the disciples, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Notice this. Jesus asked Philip, hey, what are we gonna do for all these people? But it's a test. What do you mean it's a test? It can't be a test unless there's a right answer and a wrong answer. Jesus already knows what the disciples are going to do, but they aren't going to do it. So Jesus knows how he's going to do it. He already knows what he plans to do. See, Jesus believes his disciples are capable of solving the problems in front of them through their deep connection to him. They just went out without any clothes, without any money, without a staff, without anything extra on them. And Jesus just showed them God's gonna provide. He's gonna meet your need. You will never be lacking. You will never not have enough. I promise. They come back and they're all telling their stories. They're listening to the different ways that what Jesus said came true in each of their stories, which is why being in a small group and sharing the story of what God is doing is so powerful. Because you don't just grow from what God's doing in you, you grow from hearing others testify to the goodness of God in everyday life. But they come back and they're telling you stories. And now you got all these thousands of people, it's late in the day, like, Jesus, you gotta send these people away. They gotta feed their families. They're hungry, we're hungry. And Jesus says, you feed them. What if just one of those disciples and went, yeah, I think I can do that after everything I just saw and heard. But they didn't. It says in verse 8, another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go with so many? If you don't know the story, Jesus goes, yeah, that's enough. 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish? This is a small boy's meal. It's a Lunchable. And Peter, he was at least bold enough to go, man, I don't know, anybody got anything? You? Can we use it? Yeah? Come with me. Jesus, man, I don't know what you could do with this. And what I love about that is Peter was this close. He was this close. He'd seen enough to believe that Jesus could do something. But I think, and I can't wait to get to heaven and ask Jesus and Peter. I really can't. Like, this is one of the millions of questions I got. Like, I just want to know. I think Jesus is inviting Peter to be bold enough to do it himself. I think this is a training moment. Peter, one day you're going to do all this without me. You don't need me in the room. Do you believe that? Do you believe that the power and the authority of God is in you, with you? Everything that I have, I'm giving to you. You don't have to have me with you because I've given it to you. I mean, with the Holy Spirit inside us, those who've surrendered our lives to God, we believe God has actually come to us and filled us with himself. You have that power and the authority right now. You will never be lacking for what you need. You will never be lacking. So it makes me think of these questions, and I want you to just sit with them for a minute. Just sit with these questions. Think about this, okay? What if the boy who brought the loaves and the fish had greedily kept his food for only himself? And what's gonna happen if we do that today? Just think about that for a minute. We saw Jesus take the fish and the loaves and multiply it and feed 5,000 to 15,000 people. We don't know how many. From 5 small pieces of bread and 2 fish. It's a very small and meager amount. But if that boy had said, no, I'm gonna eat, I'm gonna be good, let them worry about them. But instead, every gospel book testifies to the faith of this young boy. But what about this? What might have happened if the disciples had actually taken up Jesus' challenge to feed the people? How might we tell this story different in every book? Could you imagine Peter if he went, Jesus, I want to give this one a try? Could you imagine the joy in Jesus' faith? So many times Jesus is amazed by the faith of the people, and he does exactly what they're asking, and he celebrates them. And we hear and we read about those stories. And I wonder if Jesus would have been like, yes, Peter, you try. But Peter didn't. Not yet. Later on in the book of Acts, we'll read about many things that Peter does because he finally gets it. So this is no knock if you're not there yet. Peter wasn't there yet either, but what's keeping you from getting there? Better yet, what might happen if we, Kingsway today, we took the chance to try something bold? Something you believe God's calling you to, but it sounds terrifying and hard or scary or time-consuming or it takes a sacrifice. Usually the more you have to sacrifice, the more you get to see God show up. One more question for you to think about. Where is your fear interfering with your faith? Is there somewhere in your life where you're just so afraid of your situation or the problem or the pain or the whatever it's in front of you that you're withdrawing and you're pulling away instead of engaging and drawing close and just seeing what God could do in that moment? And how might you take a bold step to join God in what he is doing in the world? Here at Kingsway, we have a bunch of cultural values. They're written on the wall out there. You should read them sometime. But one of those values is this: boldly trust God. Because we believe hard things have nothing on God. So we take bold steps of faith and obedience and trust that he has amazing plans ahead. We're willing to give up the good things for the best things. I'm gonna say nothing, surprising, for about 30 to 60 seconds. I want you to just sit with these questions. I don't want you to listen to the Spirit of God. Maybe it would be helpful if you just say, God, would you speak to me? And then I'll tell you what we're doing next. exactly where this is gonna land for everybody, but this is a moment that I feel like we need to just worship our Savior. Remind ourselves again of how awesome he is. And so here's the thing. Some of you may not know this song. It'll be hard for you to sing with us, but I want to encourage you to let the words then wash over you. But if you do know it and you are familiar with it, or if you figure it out along the way, I want to encourage you to be bold. Don't be afraid to lift your hands, fall on your face, and just truly worship the one who is with you right now. If you want to stand, stand. If you want to kneel, kneel. If you want to sit, sit. Just let this be between you and him alone.